The Endurance had been a beacon of hope for the human race, a state-of-the-art exploration ship designed to push the boundaries of space. But nothing could prepare Captain Jonathan Miles and his crew for what lay ahead when their journey took an unexpected turn. The ship's engines sputtered as the alarm rang out, signaling something was terribly wrong. In a matter of seconds, the mighty ship began to lose control, spinning wildly in the deep, endless black. Miles struggled with the controls, his mind racing as he fought to stabilize the ship. But it was too late. With a violent crash, the Endurance hit the planet's surface, carrying through the dense atmosphere before slamming into the ground with a deafening boom. Dust and debris filled the air as the crew scrambled to their feet, shaken but alive. The planet they had crashed on was uncharted, its coordinates unknown, its features unfamiliar. They had no idea what they had landed on, but one thing was clear: they were stranded. "Status report," Miles shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos. Lieutenant Anna Reed, the ship's communications officer, was the first to answer. "We're alive, Captain. The ship's heavily damaged, but we have basic survival equipment. There's no signal, no way to call for help." Miles surveyed the wreckage of the Endurance, the once proud ship now reduced to a twisted mass of metal and sparks. His heart sank as he realized they were completely isolated, alone on an alien world. The air was thick and humid, and the landscape stretched out before them in all directions: dense forests, towering trees, and strange, unfamiliar plant life. The ground was uneven, with deep cracks and jagged rocks scattered across the terrain. A strange, otherworldly scent hung in the air. But there was something more unsettling than just the unfamiliar environment: the quiet. The crew began to gather their equipment, readying themselves for the worst. But before they could even begin their plans, a strange noise echoed through the trees. It was a low, growling sound, like something large was prowling nearby. "We've got company," Miles said, his voice steady as he motioned for his team to move. "Stay alert, everyone." They moved quickly, setting up camp near the wreckage of the Endurance. Miles couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was watching them from the shadows. The air felt charged, tense, as if the very planet itself was aware of their presence. Night fell quickly on Trivac 7, and with it came the oppressive silence. The crew huddled around a fire, doing their best to stay warm and alert. Miles had a sense of dread gnawing at him, an instinctual warning that they were not alone in this wilderness. It wasn't long before his instincts proved true. The first attack came without warning. A shriek shattered the night, followed by the sound of something massive moving through the trees. Before anyone could react, something leaped from the shadows. The creature was a blitter of dark fur, its glowing eyes locking onto Miles as it charged. A blinding flash of light erupted from the creature's mouth, a burst of energy that sent one of the crew members, Sergeant Jackson, flying back into a nearby tree. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. "Defensive positions," Miles shouted, grabbing his blaster and raising it toward the beast. But before he could pull the trigger, another creature appeared, then another, and another. There was no escape. The creatures were fast, too fast. They surrounded the group, their movements fluid and precise. The crew fought back fiercely, but it was clear that they were outmatched. These beings were unlike anything they had encountered before. The creatures moved with a level of coordination that suggested intelligence, and their strength was beyond human limits. One of the beasts lunged at Miles, its claws swiping inches from his face. He dodged, narrowly avoiding its deadly strike, and fired his weapon. The blast hit, but the creature barely flinched. It was as though the weapons had no effect on it. "This isn't working," Reed shouted, her voice filled with panic. "We need to retreat." But retreat was not an option. The creatures closed in, their eyes glowing with a hunger that sent chills down Miles' spine. Then, as suddenly as they had attacked, the creatures stopped. Miles froze, gun still raised, waiting for the next move. But the creatures didn't strike. Instead, they retreated into the forest, vanishing into the shadows from which they had come. The silence returned. "What in the world?" Reed gasped, her voice trembling. Miles looked at the others, his mind racing. "I don't know what they are, but they're not like any predator we've encountered before." But there was one thing Miles was certain of. This was only the beginning. The Endurance was lost. The crew was stranded, and they had just come face to face with something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The crew of the Endurance had just landed in the territory of something ancient, something far beyond their understanding. And as the night closed in around them, Miles realized the truth. The true battle for survival was only beginning. No one survives the Ravenous alien females tribe, except for him. The dawnlight crept through the dense forest, casting eerie shadows over the wreckage of the Endurance. Captain Jonathan Miles stood alone amid the wreckage, his thoughts racing as he scanned the scattered bodies of his crew. The creatures had come in the night, fast and silent, and in the blink of an eye, the crew had been torn apart. Miles had barely managed to escape the assault, his survival a mix of luck, skill, and sheer determination. Now, the ship was in ruins, and the remaining survivors were scattered or incapacitated. Sergeant Jackson was still unconscious, his body slumped against a tree, while Lieutenant Reed was attempting to stabilize one of the injured crew members. But for all their efforts, there was only one question on Miles' mind. How long could they last on this planet without help? The creatures hadn't come back, yet. The calm that followed their attack was unnatural, a silence that was almost as oppressive as the forest itself. Miles knew they had to move quickly, but the thought of venturing back into the woods filled him with dread. He crouched by the wreckage of the Endurance, trying to assess the damage. The communication system was down, rendering any attempts at calling for help useless. The navigation system had been destroyed, and the fuel supply was almost gone. In short, they were stranded, stuck on a hostile world with no way of contacting the outside. "We need to get out of here," Miles muttered under his breath, glancing at the wreckage. "We need a plan." But the plan had to come together quickly. Jackson was still out cold, and Reed was struggling to keep the wounded from going into shock. They were all in no condition to move, but Miles knew they couldn't stay where they were. They were sitting ducks. Miles grabbed a nearby blaster rifle and checked its power cells. It was a backup weapon, one he hadn't planned to use unless absolutely necessary. He hated to think about it. But the truth was clear. They needed to move before the creatures came back. He made his decision. "Reed," Miles said, his voice firm. "We need to get the survivors to the higher ground. There's a ridge about 2 kilometers east. It'll give us a better vantage point and some defense. Can you manage the wounded?" Reed looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "I'll do what I can, Captain," she replied, her voice steady. She was strong, stronger than she looked. "Good," Miles nodded. "We'll move out in 30 minutes. Get them ready." As Reed moved to organize the others, Miles took a moment to think. He didn't know what those creatures were, but he had a gut feeling they weren't done with them. The forest felt alive, as though the trees themselves were watching them. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an unknown animal. Miles knew they had to move fast. They couldn't afford to wait around for another attack. He had seen the creatures' speed, their coordination. They wouldn't give them another chance to escape. His mind raced as he gathered his thoughts. What were those things? Why had they attacked? He had seen the intelligence in their eyes. They weren't simple predators. They were something more, something with a purpose. But what was it? And why had they spared him? The questions gnawed at him, but there was no time for answers now. They had to survive first. The first encounter with the Clithery matriarchy. As Miles made his way through the wreckage, he found something strange in the dirt. A footprint. It was larger than any human footprint, and had a strange design. The shape was unmistakable, a triangular imprint, with sharp, angular edges. Miles crouched down, studying it carefully. The print was fresh. Whatever had made it had been here recently. He straightened up quickly, scanning the trees around him. The air felt thick with tension, as though something was waiting. The feeling of being watched returned, sharper this time. A sudden movement to his left caught his attention. His hand instinctively went to his blaster, but before he could raise it, a figure stepped into view. A woman, but not human. She was tall, easily 6 feet, with skin that shimmered under the sunlight, a deep shade of purple. Her long hair was dark, braided intricately down her back, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. She was wearing armor made from materials Miles had never seen before, lightweight but sturdy, adorned with strange markings. The woman's gaze locked with his, her expression unreadable. She held a spear, an elegant, deadly weapon, pointed at the ground. "Who are you?" Miles asked, his voice low but steady. He knew better than to assume she was an ally. The woman did not answer. Instead, she took a step forward, her eyes scanning him as though assessing his worth. Then, she spoke in a language he didn't understand, her voice smooth and melodic, but filled with authority. "I don't understand you," Miles said, slowly raising his weapon. "But I'm not your enemy." The woman raised her hand, signaling for him to lower his weapon. She gestured toward the wreckage, then back to Miles, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she spoke again in a language that was completely foreign to him. Then a voice suddenly echoed through his comm device, faint but clear. "Miles, this is Reed. We've got company, more of them. We need to move now." Miles' heart raced as he turned back to the woman, who had vanished into the shadows just as quickly as she had appeared. He wasn't alone anymore, and he had no idea who or what the woman was, but he had no time to dwell on that. The creatures were coming, and this planet had just become a lot more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. As he hurried back to the survivors, he knew that the true challenge had only just begun. The days following the attack were filled with uncertainty. Captain Jonathan Miles and the remaining crew members, Lieutenant Reed and Sergeant Jackson, had made their way to the ridge. They had to move carefully, avoiding the strange creatures that had already proven to be far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The creatures seemed to be watching them, keeping their distance, but never fully leaving them alone. The survivors were exhausted. Jackson had finally regained consciousness, but his injuries were severe. Reed did her best to care for him, but there was little they could do with the limited medical supplies. The terrain was difficult to navigate, and every step forward felt like they were being hunted. The eerie feeling of being watched never left them. They had settled on the ridge for the time being, a rocky outcrop that offered them some protection from the creatures lurking in the woods below. The view was breathtaking, but there was no time to appreciate it. Their priority was survival, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the land they had crashed on was far from ordinary. "We need to figure out what we're up against," Miles said, looking out over the alien landscape. "We can't just keep running. Sooner or later, we'll run out of options." Reed nodded, her face drawn with exhaustion. "I agree, but we still don't know enough about these creatures. We barely survived the last attack. Whatever they are, they seem to know exactly where we are and what we're doing." Miles rubbed his chin, his mind racing. He had been on many missions in his career, but nothing like this. The creatures weren't just animals. They were intelligent, calculating, and relentless. And then there was the mysterious woman. The alien he had encountered before, was she one of them? He couldn't be sure, but he had a feeling she might hold the key to understanding the situation. "We can't wait for them to come to us," Miles said, making a decision. "We need to go on the offensive. If we can learn their movements, their behavior, we might be able to predict their next move." "We'll need more supplies," Reed said, "and weapons. The blasters barely did anything against them. They're too tough, too fast. Miles glanced down at the wreckage of the Endurance, which was now a smoldering heap of twisted metal. It was clear there was little left to salvage. But he had an idea. "We'll need to move to the other side of the ridge," Miles said. "There's an old storage facility there. It's a long shot, but it could have some useful equipment." Reed and Jackson exchanged looks, but they both nodded. They didn't have a choice. The creatures were closing in. The first step toward resistance. Miles led the group down the rocky path, careful to avoid making any noise that might attract attention. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. They had to be smart. They had to adapt. As they reached the bottom of the ridge, they noticed the air felt different, heavier, almost as if the forest itself was pressing down on them. The strange plants that lined the path seemed to twist and move, reacting to their presence. It was a world unlike any other. They continued their journey, reaching the storage facility just before nightfall. The building was old, its structure weathered and worn, but it still stood strong. It was tucked away in a small valley, hidden by dense trees and overgrowth. Miles felt a sense of relief. This was their chance. Inside the facility, they found a cache of old supplies, food, tools, and weapons. But as Miles searched through the crates, something caught his eye. A set of data pads, ancient and covered in dust. He wiped them off and powered them up. The screen flickered for a moment, and then a map appeared, detailed coordinates marking locations all over the planet. "This is it," Miles said, showing Reed and Jackson. "These are the locations of Clithery tribes." Reed squinted at the screen. "Clithery? You mean the aliens?" Miles nodded. "The map shows the territory of the Clithery matriarchy. I think this is where they live, where they come from. This could give us an advantage. If we can learn more about them, we might be able to turn the tables." Jackson was still recovering, his body aching from the previous attacks, but he pushed through. "This is it, then. We go after them." "We don't have a choice," Miles replied. "We need to understand them, learn their weaknesses. If we're going to survive, we need to be smarter than them." An unexpected ally. As the group prepared to leave the facility, a rustling noise interrupted their quiet planning. Miles froze, signaling for everyone to stop. He motioned for Reed and Jackson to take cover, his hand tight on his blaster. The rustling grew louder, closer. Miles' heart raced. Was it the creatures again? Or something else? Suddenly, a figure appeared from behind the trees. Miles tensed, ready for another attack. But it wasn't one of the creatures. It was the woman, the same alien he had encountered before. She stood in front of them, watching them carefully, her expression unreadable. Her armor gleamed in the low light, and her dark eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity. "You're not alone," she said in a soft, melodic voice. "But you will be soon if you stay here." Miles raised an eyebrow. "You're one of them, aren't you?" The woman nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "I am Clithery, but not like the others. They are driven by the hunt, by blood. I am not." "Why are you helping us?" Reed asked, her voice cautious. The woman smiled faintly. "Because I can see what you cannot. You are not the first to land here. And you will not be the last, unless you learn to adapt." "How do you know so much?" Miles asked. "Because I have seen them before," she replied. "I have watched their ways, and I know how they think." Miles exchanged a quick glance with Reed and Jackson. This was their chance. If they could trust her, she might be the key to surviving this nightmare. "All right," Miles said, his voice firm. "We'll listen. But we need answers. We need to know how to fight back." The woman nodded, stepping forward. "Then follow me. It's time to learn how to survive on this world." And with that, they followed her into the unknown, ready to face whatever the Clithery and this strange planet had in store for them. The alien woman, whose name was revealed to be Eshra, led the group through the dense woods of Trivac 7 with surprising ease. Her movements were silent, graceful, and confident, as if she had spent her entire life navigating this hostile world. The crew of the Endurance followed her cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Eshra had told them little about herself, only that she was different from the other Clithery. "I am an outcast," she had said, her voice tinged with something that might have been regret. "I do not share the same hunger for destruction as the others. I choose to survive, and I do not wish to see you fall as others have." Miles, Reed, and Jackson weren't sure if they could trust her, but there was no choice. They had no allies left, and this strange alien might be their only hope of surviving on this deadly planet. Eshra led them to a hidden cave, tucked beneath the roots of a massive tree. The cave was well concealed, and when they entered, the cool air inside was a welcome relief from the oppressive heat of the forest. "This is my sanctuary," Eshra said, glancing around at the simple stone walls. "I have been hiding here for many cycles. The Clithery matriarchy cannot find me here." Miles nodded. "We need to know everything you can tell us about the Clithery. Their territory, their ways, and their weaknesses. If we're going to survive, we have to learn how to fight them." Eshra hesitated before answering, her eyes shadowed with thoughts of the past. "The Clithery are a powerful and ancient species. We were once a united people, but the hunger for power tore us apart. Now, the matriarchy rules with an iron fist, driven by a primal need to conquer and consume. Their leaders, the matriarchs, are powerful, and they will not hesitate to destroy anyone who stands in their way." Miles felt a chill run down his spine. The matriarchs sounded like a force to be reckoned with, but he wasn't about to back down. "What about their hunting rituals?" he asked, already guessing what the answer would be. "They hunt to survive, but also for sport," Eshra replied, her voice hardening. "They are territorial, and any intruders, especially humans, are seen as prey. Their intelligence is vast, and they have no mercy." Reed spoke up. "Then what's our plan? How do we fight against them if they are so strong?" Eshra turned toward her, her expression serious. "We do not fight them head-on. We use their weaknesses against them. The Clithery matriarchy thrives on domination, but it has a great flaw: pride. The matriarchs are driven by their desire to prove their strength, to dominate their surroundings. If you can manipulate their pride, you can defeat them." "How do we do that?" Miles asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. Eshra's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "You must learn to blend in. The matriarchs value the hunt above all else. They will not see you as a threat if you do not act like one. You must learn the ways of the Clithery, adapt to their world, and use their arrogance against them." For a moment, the group was silent. It seemed impossible, but Miles could see the logic in Eshra's words. If they could survive long enough to study the Clithery, to learn their ways, maybe they could exploit their weaknesses. Training for survival. The next few days were spent in intense preparation. Eshra taught the crew everything she knew about the Clithery: how to move silently through the woods, how to mask their scent, and how to avoid detection. She showed them how to craft weapons from the materials found on Trivac 7, using the native flora and fauna to create traps and camouflage. Jackson, despite his injuries, threw himself into the training with surprising enthusiasm. He was determined to prove he could still be useful. Reed, ever the strategist, focused on learning how to track and read the land, memorizing the patterns of the Clithery and their hunting tactics. Miles spent hours sharpening his combat skills, though he knew that brute force alone wouldn't be enough. He had to outthink the Clithery if they were to have any chance of escaping this nightmare. Eshra was a hard teacher, pushing them to their limits. "You cannot survive in this world with weakness," she would say, her voice cold. "You must become like the Clithery in order to defeat them. Only then will you have a chance." Despite the harsh lessons, Miles found himself beginning to respect Eshra. She had endured so much on this planet, surviving alone for years, and yet her resolve was unshakable. She was their guide, their teacher, and their only hope. One evening, as the group sat around a fire, Eshra shared more about her past. "I was once part of the matriarchy," she confessed, "but I grew disillusioned with their ways. The endless hunting, the senseless violence. I wanted to live, not be a tool in their war. That is why I left." Her voice softened as she continued. "But I did not leave unscathed. The matriarchs do not forgive. They will come for me eventually, but I will not return to them." Miles understood now. Eshra was fighting her own battle, a battle for her freedom. And now, she was helping them fight for theirs. An unexpected attack. Just as the group was starting to feel a glimmer of hope, disaster struck. The ground shook violently, and a deafening roar echoed through the trees. Miles jumped to his feet, grabbing his weapon. Eshra's face turned pale, and for the first time since they had met her, Miles saw fear in her eyes. "They have found us," she whispered. "The matriarchs are near." The ground trembled again, and the sound of something large and fast moving through the forest grew louder. Miles knew they didn't have much time. The Clithery were closing in, and they were ready for the final hunt. Eshra turned to the survivors, her expression hardening. "You've learned enough. Now it's time to use it." Without another word, she grabbed a spear from the corner of the cave and motioned for them to follow. The time had come for them to face the Clithery head-on. But this time, they weren't just prey. They were ready for the hunt. The air was thick with tension as Miles and the crew stood in the cave, staring into the darkening woods beyond. The roar of the Clithery matriarchs echoed through the trees, a chilling reminder that their enemies were closer than ever. Eshra's face was grim, but her eyes burned with a determined fire. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice sharp. "When the matriarchs come, they'll bring everything they have. You need to be ready." The group nodded, each person feeling the weight of her words. This was no longer just about surviving the day. The matriarchs were coming for them, and they were ready to make sure that this time, the humans wouldn't be the hunted. Eshra led them out of the cave and into the dense undergrowth. She had taught them everything she knew about surviving in the woods, how to blend in, how to mask their scent, and how to use the environment to their advantage. Now, it was time to put that knowledge to the test. Miles adjusted his blaster, keeping it low. Reed and Jackson were silent, each of them moving with a careful determination. They had learned a lot from Eshra, but the real test was just ahead. The Clithery matriarchs were a force unlike any the crew had ever encountered. They were cunning, fast, and deadly, and their pride made them even more dangerous. They didn't hunt just for food. They hunted to prove their dominance, to assert their rule over the planet. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the matriarchs grew louder. The group huddled together, moving swiftly but quietly through the shadows. Eshra's eyes were constantly scanning the surroundings, her senses alert to every sound, every movement. "We need to get to higher ground," Eshra whispered, her voice barely audible. "The matriarchs will be able to track us if we stay in the lowlands." Miles nodded, his mind racing with strategies. He had a plan in place, but they needed the perfect moment to execute it. He had to rely on their knowledge of the Clithery's weaknesses, chief among them, their pride. If they could trick the matriarchs into believing they were no threat, it might give them the opening they needed. They reached a small ridge just as the sun dipped below the horizon. From this vantage point, they could see the movement of the Clithery in the distance. Tall, powerful figures, their eyes glowing with an eerie light, prowled through the trees. They were hunting. Eshra motioned for the group to stay low, and they crouched behind a large boulder, watching the Clithery matriarchs move through the woods. Their movements were deliberate, confident. They were in control. And that, Eshra knew, was their greatest weakness. "The matriarchs believe they are invincible," she said softly, almost to herself. "They are proud, but they are not infallible. We just need to make them believe we're more than they can handle." Miles exchanged a look with Reed and Jackson. It was risky, but it might just work. If they could convince the matriarchs that the humans were a real threat, they might hesitate, unsure of how to deal with them. The hesitation could be their chance to strike. The ambush. Eshra quickly set up a series of traps around the ridge, using the natural resources of the forest to create camouflage and distractions. The group worked together, setting up what looked like an ambush, but it was more than that. It was a psychological attack. They wanted the matriarchs to think they had something powerful hiding in the forest, something they couldn't defeat easily. Miles watched as the Clithery matriarchs grew closer, their eyes scanning the area, clearly sensing something was wrong. The prideful arrogance that had marked their every step earlier now seemed to waver. The matriarchs were no longer certain of their victory. "They're coming," Reed whispered, her voice tense with anticipation. The first matriarch stepped into the clearing, her massive form outlined by the moonlight. She was regal, her armor a reflection of her status, her eyes burning with fierce intelligence. She paused, sniffing the air, and then her gaze locked onto the group's hiding spot. The matriarch snarled, her lip curling in a show of dominance. She wasn't afraid, but she was cautious. She had no way of knowing what they had in store for her. Miles motioned for Ishra to stay back. The time had come. He stood up, stepping forward into the open. "We are not what you think we are," he called out, his voice clear and firm. "We are not just prey. We are a challenge, a worthy opponent." For a moment, the matriarch stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, a smile spread across her face. "So the humans wish to play at being hunters," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you can stand against us?" "We don't have to stand against you," Miles replied, his voice steady. "But we can make you think we can." The matriarch's eyes flickered, a glimmer of doubt flashing in them. She was used to prey that cowered, to enemies that ran in fear. This human was different. He didn't fear her. As the matriarch took a step forward, the ground beneath her feet suddenly shifted. A trap Eshra had set earlier sprung to life, sending a barrage of sharp, thorn-like vines toward her. The matriarch shrieked in surprise, her prideful composure shattered for a moment as she struggled to free herself. That was all the opening they needed. Miles rushed forward, leading the charge as the group attacked. Reed and Jackson flanked the matriarch, using the environment to stay hidden and strike with precision. Eshra's traps distracted the other Clithery, making them hesitate just long enough for the humans to land a few crucial blows. It wasn't a fight to the death. It didn't need to be. The Clithery matriarchs were proud, but they were also calculating. Once they realized they were not facing easy prey, they hesitated. And in that hesitation, the humans struck. The retreat. After a tense few minutes, the matriarchs finally pulled back, realizing that they had underestimated their enemies. They growled in frustration, but they knew they had been outplayed. The group stood in the clearing, breathless but victorious. For now, the Clithery had retreated, but they wouldn't be gone for long. Miles glanced at Eshra, who was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and triumph. "We've made our mark," he said quietly, "but this isn't over. They'll come back stronger." Eshra nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow. "And we'll be ready." In that moment, they realized something crucial. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for control of their fate. The Clithery matriarchs had underestimated them, and that was their greatest mistake. The humans were no longer just prey. They had proven they were a force to be reckoned with, and the matriarchs would soon learn just how dangerous they could be. The battle with the Clithery matriarchs had been a wake-up call. Though they had managed to outsmart their enemies temporarily, Miles, Eshra, Reed, and Jackson knew that this was just the beginning. The Clithery would return, and when they did, they would come with more strength and fury. The humans had made a dangerous enemy, and the matriarch's pride would demand revenge. The team gathered around the small fire that crackled quietly in the center of their camp. The forest around them was eerily quiet now, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The attack had been a success, but it was a fragile victory. It was clear that they couldn't keep this up forever. They needed a better plan. Eshra sat apart from the group, her eyes scanning the shadows. She had always been a solitary figure, even among her own people, but now, as an outcast, she had no choice but to work with the humans. Her knowledge of the Clithery was their best chance of survival, but even she knew that knowledge alone would not be enough. "We can't hide forever," she said, her voice low. "The matriarchs are relentless. They'll come again, and next time, they won't hesitate to destroy us." Miles nodded, thinking through their options. "So what do we do? We can't just keep running." Eshra's gaze hardened. "We need to strike first." Reed, who had been sitting quietly, raised an eyebrow. "Strike first? You mean we go after them? We can barely survive when they come to us." Eshra's expression didn't change. "Yes, we need to attack their base, their stronghold. We need to show them that we are no longer prey, that we can reach them, that we can threaten their leadership. If we hit them where it hurts, we might just break their confidence. They thrive on pride. If we can shatter that, we might stand a chance." Jackson, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "You're asking us to storm their stronghold. We don't even know where it is." "I do," Eshra said, her voice steady. "I was once part of the matriarchy. I know their secrets, their hidden places. They have a fortress deep within the mountains. It's protected, yes, but not invulnerable. We can get in. We just need to be clever." The others exchanged wary looks. The plan sounded almost impossible, but the more they thought about it, the more it seemed like their only real option. If they kept waiting for the Clithery to come to them, they would always be on the defensive. They needed to take control. Miles looked to Eshra, his determination matching hers. "How do we get there?" Eshra gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We will need to travel through the heart of the Clithery's territory. It's risky, but we'll use the forest to our advantage. I know the paths they don't use, the places they avoid. We'll move fast and stay out of sight. If we're careful, we can make it." Reed leaned forward, thinking out loud. "We can't fight them all at once. We'll need to be strategic. A direct assault would be suicide." Eshra agreed. "I know. We'll go in quietly, plant the seeds of fear, disrupt their operations. Once we weaken their structure, we'll have a chance to strike at their heart. But we'll need to be swift." Jackson crossed his arms. "And after that?" "After that," Eshra said, her eyes narrowing, "we destroy their leadership. Without their matriarchs, they'll fall apart. They'll be nothing more than a pack of wild animals. And that is when we end it." The group was silent for a moment, considering the risks of such a bold plan. It was clear that it wouldn't be easy, but it was their best shot. Finally, Miles spoke. "Let's do it. The journey begins." The next day, the group set out on their dangerous journey toward the Clithery fortress. The forest that had once seemed like a safe haven now felt like a labyrinth of shadows. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig could be the sound of an approaching matriarch or her hunting party. Eshra led the way, her movements swift and deliberate. She knew the terrain like the back of her hand, avoiding known Clithery patrols and leading the group through narrow paths that would go unnoticed by the enemy. But even Eshra's confidence couldn't mask the danger. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the Clithery's domain. As they traveled, Miles kept a sharp eye on the surroundings. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were on a mission to strike at the very heart of the Clithery, to show them that humans were not helpless victims. But with every step forward, the weight of their decision pressed down on him. There was no turning back now. By the end of the day, they had made it to a high ridge that overlooked a vast expanse of Clithery territory. Below, they could see the movement of the matriarch's forces, their patrols sweeping through the area like clockwork. It was a chilling sight, but it also reminded them of the stakes. They couldn't afford to fail. Eshra pointed to a distant mountain range. "The fortress is in those mountains. We'll have to cross this territory to reach it, but we can't be seen." Jackson let out a low whistle. That's a lot of ground to cover. We'll move at night, Eshra said. The Clithery are most active during the day, but at night, they let their guard down. We'll use that to our advantage. The night march. The group traveled through the night, moving under the cover of darkness. Every step felt like a gamble. The Clithery were everywhere, their glowing eyes searching the forest, their keen senses alert to any movement. They passed through dense thickets, crossed streams, and climbed rocky hills, each obstacle feeling like it could be their last. But they pushed forward, driven by the hope that if they could reach the fortress, they could turn the tide of this war. By the time dawn was breaking, they were deep inside the Clithery territory, only a few miles from their goal. The fortress loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. It was massive, surrounded by towering walls and guarded by dozens of Clithery warriors. Eshra paused for a moment, studying the fortress. We're close now. Stay alert. This is where it gets dangerous. Miles tightened his grip on his weapon. The real fight was about to begin. But they had no choice. They had to succeed. For their future, for humanity's survival, they couldn't afford to fail. The group had finally reached the base of the Clithery fortress, and the heavy weight of the moment pressed down on them. Miles, Eshra, Reed, and Jackson stood in the shadow of the massive stone walls, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The fortress loomed before them, a fortress of power and pride, built to house the ruling matriarchs of the Clithery. But to the humans, it was a symbol of the struggle they had to overcome. Eshra crouched low, motioning for the group to follow. "We can't afford to make any noise," she whispered. "The Clithery's patrols are constant. If we're spotted, we'll be overwhelmed." Miles nodded, his mind racing. The stakes had never been higher. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for the future of humanity. If they failed now, they would be lost forever in the Clithery's unforgiving grip. "We'll approach from the west," Eshra continued, pointing toward a narrow gap between the trees. "There's a path that leads behind the fortress. It's less guarded, but it's still dangerous. Stay close." The group moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows and using the trees as cover. They had learned to move quietly over the past weeks, their survival depending on it. But now, with the fortress so close, every sound seemed to echo. Every crack of a twig felt like a warning. As they approached the fortress, the air grew thick with tension. The Clithery's presence was everywhere, standing tall at the gates, patrolling the walls, watching from high towers. The humans had to remain hidden, or they would be spotted in an instant. They couldn't risk a fight in the open. Not yet. Finally, they reached the gap in the fortress wall. Eshra paused, her sharp eyes scanning the area ahead. "This is it. Once we're inside, there's no turning back." Miles clenched his fists. "We're not turning back." The humans slipped through the gap, entering the inner courtyard of the fortress. The walls were towering, the stone cold and unyielding. But it wasn't the fortress that made their hearts race. It was the presence of the matriarchs, who ruled this place with absolute power. As they moved deeper into the fortress, they heard voices. Low murmurs echoed from behind closed doors, likely the commanders and leaders of the Clithery discussing plans. This was where it would all happen. This was the moment they had been preparing for. Eshra led them toward the central chamber, the heart of the fortress. The matriarchs would be there. And once they reached the chamber, the humans would make their move. The matriarchs' pride. Inside the chamber, the Clithery matriarchs were gathered. There were 5 of them, each more imposing than the last. Their presence was commanding, and the air in the room seemed to crackle with their power. The matriarchs were the rulers of the Clithery, feared by their own kind and beyond. They ruled with pride and strength, believing themselves untouchable. But the humans had already proven they were not easily defeated. And now, they were going to prove that they were more than capable of taking the fight to their enemies. Eshra's voice was steady as she whispered to the group, "We take them by surprise. We use their pride against them. Once we strike, they'll be in disarray. Don't hesitate." With a deep breath, Miles nodded. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't afford to let fear take over. This was it. They were here to destroy the leadership of the Clithery, to shatter the foundation of their dominance. They moved quickly, taking positions around the chamber, each one knowing their role. Reed, Jackson, and Eshra positioned themselves near the entrances, while Miles crept closer to the center. They had to be swift, precise, and smart. The strike. It was Reed who made the first move. She tossed a small reflective device into the center of the chamber, and in an instant, the matriarch's eyes locked onto it. The light caught their attention, and for a moment, they were distracted, just long enough for the humans to strike. Miles leaped from the shadows, moving swiftly toward the first matriarch. He fired his blaster, not aiming to kill, but to incapacitate. A direct hit to the matriarch's shoulder sent her crashing to the ground, stunned. Jackson quickly followed, taking out another matriarch with a shot to the leg, sending her sprawling to the floor. Eshra, using the knowledge of the matriarch's tactics, threw a small device to disorient the remaining Clithery. It created a burst of bright light and a loud noise, temporarily blinding and deafening them. It was enough to give the humans an advantage, but they couldn't afford to waste time. The matriarchs were resilient, and they would recover quickly. As the last two matriarchs regrouped, one of them, her eyes glowing with fury, turned toward Eshra. "You dare betray us," she growled. "You who were once one of us." Eshra stood tall, her voice calm. "I betrayed nothing. I did what I had to in order to survive. You will fall today, and your pride will be your undoing." With that, the final battle began. The final confrontation. The remaining matriarchs were furious, but the humans had the advantage of surprise. They moved with precision, striking at the heart of the Clithery leadership. The matriarchs fought back fiercely, but they weren't used to such tactics. They were used to overwhelming their enemies, not facing opponents who knew their weaknesses. Eshra, in a fierce duel with one of the remaining matriarchs, kept her focus. She knew that if she could defeat this one, the others would falter. Her blaster fired, narrowly missing the matriarch's head, but the shot hit the wall behind her, creating a small explosion. The matriarch stumbled, giving Eshra the opening she needed. With a quick move, she incapacitated her enemy, sending the matriarch crumbling to the ground.